I'm going to try and answer some of the questions that came up yesterday that I've written down, and also hopefully some other questions that have bubbled up overnight from you here. And then I'm going to talk about what some of the implications might be for this work, pull those out. And then we'll split into smaller groups and just discuss some of that, and then there'll be time for open questions after that discussion. And then we're going to do a quick exercise, which is sort of the beginning of something, I think, which is looking at values in Swedish society, where we think the different values that we were talking about yesterday come from, are strengthened by. Then we'll break, or there'll just be a quick exercise before the break, and then really the second half is all for Marta, Anders and Pella, who are going to be leading on the facilitation of just thinking about taking things forward. So there'll be time for open discussions where you can talk about what you want to talk about. I'll float around for the second half so that if there are any questions or things. And then we'll be thinking about next steps, and there's a closing exercise. So there's that thing. It's values. There are these intrinsic values which we saw yesterday seem to be more helpful towards social and environmental issues, and there are these extrinsic values which are less helpful. And their intention on some level. So we value all of those things on the circumplex, just to varying degrees. And that sort of goes some way to explaining how complicated we are and how conflicted we are as individuals all the time. They're not characteristics, so we talked a bit about the language around values not being quite the same as necessarily the motivations. And then there are these three effects. So you can engage a value, and it will become more important to people temporarily. When you do that, the opposing values will become less important temporarily, and the compatible values will also be sort of engaged or fired up. So they influence lots of our behaviours, values, and lots of our attitudes. And the most important thing, I think, is this one, which is that when they're engaged, when they're strengthened over time, which means that it's lots of things in society that decide sort of what our values are overall. And we talked about some of the different things that seem to influence them. And then within this, we know that threat and fear is a big one that shifts. Lack of security, threat and fear is something that shifts people to be much more extrinsic. And there were lots of studies on that. And then we talked briefly about framing and the way in which the language that we use connects with different values, which is important, I think. So questions from day one. So I wrote some of them down, the good ones. And if you have any others, then once I've sort of... So someone asked about whether there are any twin studies to see the differences in sort of experience that people have, which is amazing because there are. They're not on values specifically within this model, but they're on materialism, so how much stuff people want to acquire. And they show, surprisingly, actually, that there seems to be no genetic effect. There is nothing inherent in our genes that decides how materialistic we are. It seems to be entirely about our sort of environment and surroundings and upbringing and things. So whether that seems to apply to values probably on some level as well, but there isn't any direct research on that. But there are links between materialism and extrinsic values. Someone asked, where do we get our intrinsic values from? Well, there were some studies that pointed that out yesterday, so we know that education on the whole, excluding law and business and some other subjects like that, seem to promote self-direction values. But we also know, even within television, we know that nature programs, it seem to promote intrinsic values, so programs about nature. But also, I think, which we'll have an opportunity to later, the best way to think about that is to think about where your own intrinsic values come from. And why you value some of the things that we were talking about before, where those came from, and to ask each other and talk to each other about why it is, which hopefully we'll have some space to do later on. But I think it takes a bit of time to think about, but it's quite obvious most of the time where those things came from. Someone asked about values and needs and how they interrelate, particularly in relation to Maslow. There is some correlation between values and needs in terms of, we know that people, like I was saying yesterday, who are in less materially secure situations, who are on lower incomes are more likely to gravitate towards extrinsic values, or on very low incomes at least. A lot of Maslow's work is actually not very empirical. There hasn't actually been that much work proving that there's this sort of hierarchy of needs, and that you have to have these certain ones fulfilled before you can attain these other ones. So I don't think it relates. I think my understanding from Tim Kasser, particularly in the US, is that the intrinsic values satisfy some basic psychological needs that we need, and the extrinsic values seem to do a worse job of doing that. So they don't satisfy those needs as well, which I think fits when you look to see when some of the studies talking about greater alcohol and tobacco use, greater personality disorders, less empathy and things when you're more extrinsically oriented, because you're not sort of fulfilling those psychological needs that are associated more with the intrinsic values. Someone asked, what's strongest, our own values or group values, so the group around us? I think that we're very social animals, aren't we? So the group values are quite strong. They will have an impact on us. But we can all think about situations that we can remember where someone has stood up against group values and said, no, I don't want to do this thing because this is why, or I'm not going to go and do this and this is why. So I think there are times when you can stand up against group values, and will do. The obvious point, though, is also that we will find groups with values like our own. So we're all here, lots of you are part of transition groups and others because you move towards places that seem to represent and reflect your values. You can also, though, be forced into groups, and then your values, either you reject that group's values or you sort of grow into those values as well. So we know in some professions, professions seem to... where there is more freedom in your work, you seem to gravitate towards self-direction values, even if you don't hold those values to be strong in the first place. And that seems to be because of the group, not just the work environment, but also the peer group, the friends you pick up from that place, then sort of expand those horizons. Someone asked about us and them. Does this make people good and bad, or is there a risk in talking about this that makes people good and bad? That comes up sometimes when we're talking about this stuff, and I think it's that us being used to thinking on and off or in binary. So we talk about intrinsic and extrinsic values, and so you can imagine those as good and bad. But I don't think it maps onto people as similarly, because the point is we hold all of these. It's a spectrum, and it's how important that we place different ones are. So we can say that these values from the studies, I think, have good and bad outcomes for the sort of issues that we're concerned about. And so I don't think, though, that we can say there are good and bad people. The more extrinsically oriented people may not be as helpful for these issues, but it's not to say that they can't change or that there isn't anything that will change in the future. And they will do plenty of things that are intrinsic that help our issues at different times, depending on the context they're in or the external sort of environment. Someone said extrinsic values seem to be contagious. How do you stay solid? Which I thought was funny. Someone else also asked, why is it that Sweden has shifted so quickly from intrinsic to extrinsic values? Which I think they're sort of related. Obviously, the second question assumes that Sweden has shifted from intrinsic to extrinsic values. And I think probably, if you looked at the data, I doubt that has happened. Whether the political and sort of media landscape have or not, I don't know. I haven't been in Sweden for a very long time, but I think it comes back to that thing about when you ask people what they value, they tend to be more intrinsic. But then there are political, economic, media systems which are much more extrinsic. So that may be the thing that's changed. And I know that has happened in the UK. So the question is whether I think the people in the UK will reject that system, or whether that system will influence people to be much more extrinsic, and therefore will move in that direction, which I don't know. I don't know the answer to I think intrinsic values are really contagious. I think they're really addictive. If you think about kindness, I know that there are projects in the UK that use artists and creatives to get people to think about and express kindness. And they're incredibly powerful. So they started out in Kent, and they took 3 schools where they did these activities over a few months, and then they had 3 schools where they didn't do the activities, and they partnered with a university that measured well-being and vitality and lots of these sort of measures, openness to strangers and things. And they did maybe 5 interventions, 5 activities with the 3 schools, and they're really good activities. One of them is bringing in older people and asking them to reflect on times during their childhood that they remember kind acts, and talking to the children about those kind acts, and then they have a discussion around kindness. And there's lots of other activities. And they found that in those schools, the well-being and the general openness to strangers and lots of other social and environmental indicators just went through the roof and were much higher for those schools. And they went back 8 months later and found that there was still an effect for those children. So extrinsic values may be contagious, but I think intrinsic ones are much more so. If the activities or the projects are designed really well, I think. Someone else asked, how does gender relate to values? Apparently not as much as the researchers thought it would. So I think my understanding is that women are slightly more intrinsic than men, but they also have slightly higher security values on average. But those differences are not huge, and they're much smaller than they thought, and much smaller than I think they are in some other psychological sort of measures. Is the debate focused on the system or the individual's behaviour? I tried to sort of point it out yesterday, but it may not have been clear enough. A lot of the studies around the psychology are very individual because they're measuring individuals, but I think the debate should be around the system as much as possible, because it's this framework or structure of society that seems to influence individuals' values a lot, and it's the bit that we miss out and ignore. Having said that, there are lots of people who work in groups with people and individuals, so it feels like there are some things that Common Cause and the values stuff can help with that, which we'll maybe talk about later. And then the $64,000 question, or I shouldn't use that frame, but how can we get people to act in line with their intrinsic values? And I think hopefully the implications will get to some of that. But I think it's about changing those systems and structures as much as possible to reflect people's intrinsic values. There are things that you can do with individuals that work, but there aren't enough of us to do that with all the individuals, basically. So it's going to have to be changing some of the bigger things. And then someone handed me a card this morning that had 4 really good questions on it. So the first one is, how do you reach extrinsic people? Do you need to adapt to the information? So I'll come to a little bit in the implications on that. I think one of the things that some people confuse is because we're talking about values lots, that this is the material you would approach groups with. I don't think it would be. I think there are some things you can do about getting people to reflect on values that are really powerful, but I think you would adapt this information for any group that you're going to, really, probably. I think the very engaged groups you'd engage in this way, but it's just not going to be suitable for lots of audiences, I suppose. Is there a danger in adapting the arguments for change to the old system? For example, it's profitable to work with environmental issues. Yes, there is a danger, and I'll come to that in the implications. If you can't satisfy your basic needs, do you tend to have more intrinsic or extrinsic values? So if you can't satisfy your basic needs, I think it's extrinsic, so you become more extrinsic on the whole. And how can the business world work effectively with incorporating intrinsic values into society? That maybe is the $64,000 question. I'll come back to that in the initiatives, because we are doing some stuff with the private sector. I think it's really challenging in the way that the system is designed at the moment for them to really do it. So in the UK, the obvious block is that the legal obligation is to make profit for shareholders. So if they are pursuing intrinsic values and that reduces profit to shareholders, then they can be, the shareholders can hold them up as not acting legally. The challenge, I suppose, is about time frame and whether you can convince them that that time frame should be much longer. But at the moment, there are very few companies that seem to be doing that in the UK. But maybe I'll talk about a few. It's case studies. Are there any more questions from everyone now? Before I, no? None? We're good? Okay. Implications. This is the basic implication. Is as much as possible, if we want to solve these issues, then we need to be strengthening intrinsic values and weakening extrinsic values. And the reason that you can have the weakening of extrinsic values is because of that seesaw relationship with the values. Weakening the extrinsic values will at the same time strengthen those intrinsic values. And I think that's a really important one to think about, because I think often we focus on this one and we forget that this one is just as important in our current societies. The question then becomes how, and we don't have all the answers on this, but we have sort of some principles that we try to pull out. So the first is to understand all of this stuff and start to integrate it in the things that we do. The second is to see the bigger picture, and the final one is to work together. So if I go through each of those. So in integrating this stuff into the things that we do, we just think we should ask some questions, and these aren't the only questions, but we started to ask some of these yesterday and today. But I think asking what values, what we value, what values we're living by, both in our lives, but also in our work experiences and things, our organisations, what values are our organisations living by. Then what values and frames are we promoting in our work, and how effectively are we doing that? And then I think that for me the last two are the most important, I suppose, but that may be my bias towards NGOs, but what values and frames or the policies that we advocate promote? And then finally, what are the structures, institutions and policies that shape our society's values? And my way of thinking about that is how can we democratise these? Because I think if you democratise them, then they have a far less of an extrinsic impact than they do now. I think because of what we saw yesterday. So those are the sorts of questions that I think we should ask more, and I think the answers will be really interesting in lots of different places. For an organisation, I sort of think about it like this, that there may be implications in lots of different places within an organisation. So the implications for projects and campaigns are probably not the same for human resources, say how the larger organisations, I know for, say, WWF in the UK, the way that they structure their salaries, how much people, the inequality in that system. They have performance-related pay, so they get bonuses, financial bonuses for hitting certain targets. And so there's lots of policies like that around how the organisation runs that will foster certain values over others, and strengthen certain values in the organisation. So fundraising is a big issue, which I'll come back to later. But how, you can campaign on a particular issue, but how do you raise funds on it? And I think a lot of big NGOs fundraise in a different way than they campaign. And I know there's always big tensions and arguments between those. I think that's because fundraising has perfected the art of sort of appealing to extrinsic values very quickly in order to set up fundraising for the longer term. Not always, but there's some techniques that seem to do that. How do you organise events? And in membership, how do you engage with your members? So the Finding Frames for Development report was really critical of the way in which development groups in the UK engage with their membership. So it was very much, the literature, academic literature, calls it an arm's length situation. So you keep the members away, they give you money, you send them a magazine, and that's the sort of level of engagement the organisation has and participation. So it's a very poor model of participation for lots of big NGOs. And they were talking about that in terms of values. So this, I just threw this in earlier. It looks like some sort of horrible Rothko or something, doesn't it? But there's a lot of talk in lots of areas about segmenting different audiences. So if you imagine this is sort of, I've slightly got it wrong at the end, but less green people, more green people. I spoke earlier about, I think social marketing and the marketing approach says that you need the really difficult groups. says that you need the people who are just not green, who are, don't even think about it at all. And in the UK, at least, there's enormous amounts of resources spent on trying to convince those groups to be green. And they tend to, because it's very difficult, because they're hard to reach groups, they're either very wealthy people or very consumerist, sort of materialist groups. They tend to have to appeal to any of these values. They tend to try and pretend or create this sort of very environmental extrinsic frame or environmental extrinsic values. So they will tell people it's cool or fashionable to solve climate change, or you can make lots of money out of climate change. And even that doesn't seem to work. And I think the reason is because the social marketing models come from marketing, and when you're trying to sell things to people, when you're trying to get them to buy more stuff, I think these groups do lead people. So wealthy people and the consumerists, the people who are very much into fashion and constantly buying new clothes, probably do lead trends elsewhere. But it just seems obvious that when you're not asking people to do that, when you're asking people to actually become more civically active, to consume less, to be more responsible and things, that those groups will struggle because they're so hard to reach. So I think Common Cause probably says something about moving from here with the most engaged out to these groups, knowing that the changes in society will start to influence these groups anyway and make it easier later on to engage these groups on different things. Because inevitably these aren't boxes. These are all sort of mashed together, and these people will be in these places and know these people and spaces all the time. So the more you can get happening and the more you can showcase it and tell people about it, the better, I think. But I think in the UK this has been a real error, is enormous resources go into this. It's almost the only thing the government funds is this stuff, Westminster at least. It sort of just says, oh yeah, but we don't want you to talk to the choir. We don't want you to talk to the people who already care. You have to go for the hardest to reach audiences. And they sort of forget that the songs that the choir are singing are important. They have to be in tune and sound good, and then you get more people joining. And so, yeah, they don't. It's just an interesting model of change, I suppose, that I think is wrong. And then see the big picture, see the breadth of this and the breadth of the values. So this is an example I just talked about yesterday very briefly, but do you have red in Sweden? No? Has anyone seen this? Okay, yeah. So this was reasonably big in the UK for a bit, and it's still going, but I think it's less popular now. But so this was a campaign led by Bono of U2. Don't like the man. And it was a partnership between major global lifestyle brands and a charity set up specifically by Bono to send money to eliminate AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa, so towards AIDS treatment there, and various other issues in and around sub-Saharan Africa. And so and the idea was that these brands would make a red product. And a proportion of the revenue from those products sold would go towards the charity. So here you have a red iPad cover, you have a red, is it a Bugaboo or something? They're very popular in the UK. They're sort of off-road prams. You can take them anywhere. You can run with them. People run with them. It's this new thing. There's red headphones, red various things, red vodka, well, on a side note, the companies involved were criticised because in a number of cases they were spending more money marketing and advertising their involvement in the initiative than the revenue that was going to sub-Saharan Africa from the sale of the products. But if we just park that issue, the classic way that you would measure the success of this is how much money goes to Africa. It's very simple. You're selling these products as a simple revenue stream. And that may be a completely legitimate metric, but the problem is it ignores other ways of measuring the impact of this campaign. So I think the value stuff has things to say about this and is interesting. So for some people, by associating these things with sort of global lifestyle brands, you're engaging for some of the values, some of these extrinsic values around image and status and social recognition and things. So we know from research, and I'll show a study in a second, that they may well buy the product and the money will flow to Africa, but there is a potential that by activating and engaging those values, that there are other things they do that aren't in line with that. Okay? So you actually make it harder. But the other thing is that there are far more people that see this that don't buy one of the products. So millions of people in the UK will have seen these things being advertised and marketed, and they're engaging in all of those people, those more extrinsic values, which we know are associated with sort of antisocial, anti-environmental behaviour. So actually the risk is that you have sort of an indirect and a direct collateral damage, that you've achieved something but you've made it harder in a different sense. So there's a study that I thought I'd pull out just to make this a bit clearer. So Greg Mayer, again, in Cardiff, he received an email from the university saying you should join a car share. And so the university emailed all the professors and the doctors and academics saying, we'd like you to join a car share, we think it'd be really good. And there were 8 reasons to join a car share. And the first 7 were all extrinsic, so they were all about saving money or saving time. And the final one, I think, was something to the environment or a social benefit, and maybe you'll meet new people. And that just got him thinking about the way in which car sharing might be framed. And so he did a study on it where he gave reasons for car sharing that were either intrinsic for the first group, so they were sort of social and environmental. A second group, he just did a neutral presentation, so I don't think he told them any particular reasons about it. And the final group, he made very extrinsic, so he made it about saving money and time. And then what he did was ask participants to draw ideas for the car share, logos for the car share. And then when they'd finished drawing the logos, he said, right, we've got another activity to do. I've looked at those, that's great. And he asked them to throw the waste paper in the bin. And he had 2 bins, a recycling bin and a non-recycling, a normal bin. Okay? A very sneaky psychologist. Don't ever go to a university. And this is what he found. So those that had it pitched in terms of those intrinsic sort of the environment and social benefits, we put almost 100% of the waste paper in the recycling. And those that had been sort of framed in terms of money put less, almost just about 50% in the recycling. Now, I don't really like recycling. It's not that I don't do it, I think it's important and everything. It's just in the UK, it's the thing that people say, but I recycle. And then that's like, so I'm a socially responsible citizen, that's all I need to do. And I don't think on its own it's going to solve our problems, but this isn't about recycling. This is about seeing that there are those other things that happen when you frame something in a particular way. There are these sort of, this is collateral damage. So with the red study or with this car sharing, with the way that you frame it originally, it matters. And this is just one thing that he measured. He could have measured dozens of other things, and not just on environment. He could have measured things in terms of discrimination to others, in terms of human rights or all sorts of other things. And we would expect that there would be this sort of impact, that there would be less from the extrinsic frame and more from the environment frame. Now, this frame may be more effective at getting people to the car share, into the car share scheme. It may be more effective at them signing up. But the thing is, it depends on what how wide your frame of reference is. So if you only care about whether they join a car share, then going out for just money saving, it may well be your best option. But if you're then, depending on the breadth of how significant the issue is to you or how broad it is, if you're concerned about energy efficiency, then you start to think, well, maybe there are some things here that if we appeal to this money frame, that it becomes harder in another way. And again, broader again in terms of climate change beyond that. So it may be that when you pitch car sharing in terms of saving money, that when someone has to then later in the month visit Sweden to give a workshop, they're far more likely to fly because it takes 1/10 of the time and it costs 1/10 of the price, I can tell you. Because they have that, well, I'm someone that saves money, this is saving money is the thing where I do things, that's what I associate it with. And then even broader, if you think about sustainability, and I mean sustainability in that sort of social, economic and environmental sense, the broadest sense. if you're solving climate change but you're making people more prejudiced to outsiders, what does that mean in terms of our response to climate change in the long term? So there are some of these values, particularly around security, and we've just written a paper on energy security and the potential problems with appealing constantly to energy security and pretending like that will solve this and not talking about these environmental issues won't. So I hope does that make sense in terms of the problems with the sort of deeper impacts? Yeah, Barbara and then.
I missed actually the analysis from the Red campaign.
Yeah.
I missed the analysis from the Red campaign, the results of that, and the fact that there wasn't this kind of transfer effect. How was that judged or measured?
So they didn't measure it, and this is the point. They don't measure any of those other things in terms of the engagement with that campaign. They only measure the revenue. And I think the point is that we need to think about measuring those other things. But the difficulty with it is that they're so diffuse because these values operate everywhere that on some level it's probably impossible to measure the impact of the things that we do in this sense.
Yeah, because it's interesting actually, I'll just say, because we have Earth Hour,
Yeah.
it's a similar kind of thing. You switch off the lights and you feel good about it.
Yeah.
But actually, according to the study that we issued afterwards, it shows that over 30% of the people who engage.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Would it help if I stand up? So I work for WWF in Sweden, and we, like WWF International, we have a campaign every year that's called Earth Hour, where we ask people to switch off the lights. And you can be really critical about the campaign because it's a very simple activity, and what we're hoping is to raise awareness to climate change, etc. And as it turns out, according to SIFO and Befolkningen in Sweden, an analysis that's done after every campaign, over 30% of the people who participate in the campaign by just switching off the light do other things. They start becoming more aware of energy savings. They start recycling more anyway. There's a whole list of effects. So I'd be interested to see the same kind of thing with red, if there were actually,
Yeah. But I think that the point, I suppose, and the framing of Earth Hour is probably very different to red, but I think also the limitation with that with a similar evaluation for red, if you chose the people that had bought something, is that you also have to choose lots of people that don't buy something, that see that advertising, see a model wearing a red T-shirt, with a distorted figure or something, So that's the challenge: is the broader impact even beyond the people who actually do the thing that you want them to.
May I make a comment also?
Yeah.
Particularly when it comes to energy security. I mean, in principle, I agree with you that you should try to use arguments which are in line with the values you want to promote. But take climate change. Take the US today. If you cannot really motivate enough people with climate-related arguments, and you have a better opportunity in the short term to really make things happen in the field of energy policy, which is the most important thing right now, at least in the short term, by using arguments of energy security. Then you adopt sort of the no regrets policy option, and I think very often you have to resort to that because you are in a hurry. You cannot wait for the perfect to happen. So I'm sorry, I don't buy that.
So we'll come to this in a second, because there will be situations where appealing to those extrinsic values is a trade-off and will get you something intrinsic in the long term. So, but I think when you think about energy security, in American context particularly, what does it get you? I mean, the American context is very difficult because they're so focused on security as a society, but I think you see where that causes problems in the way that they militarize every problem they come across. So at the moment, energy security, it gets you, the pipeline from Canada for tar sands, because that's ethical oil. It gets you Arctic drilling, which they're pursuing because it's energy security. And it also gets you the militarization of the Caspian Sea and more trouble with Iran, where they militarize that ocean zone as well, in terms of, because they're securing their energy. I have massive sympathy, though, with that, with those campaigners in the US, because the society is so focused on security. It does seem to motivate some environmental concern on some level. But I just think that The challenge for them is to actually reduce the focus on security, because it will cause many problems in the future in terms of the US's response to a crisis globally. But we'll come back to it, because there will be those trade-offs, and we can talk about it more maybe later. Trade-offs. Yeah, sorry, there was one other. Yeah, sorry.
I think it's actually also about the trade-off, but I think that, for instance, the transition movement has initiated a good balance between the extrinsic and intrinsic values, which is interesting. But when going out, and I've seen this development happen now in Sweden, and when going out meeting, especially politicians, then the emphasis has been on the imminent crash of the economy and obviously of energy. So suddenly the movement is shifting towards this scare image, whereas the other values tend to be undermined. So it's also interesting how our movements are changing and shifting, because we want to reach the politicians we want to reach.
Yeah.
And I think we could expand.
Because it's a box that you can tick, and it means that you're more likely to get a promotion. And they could put that sort of stuff in their material. Or they could frame it very intrinsically and say it's a rights issue, it's about equality and about sort of integrating disabled students into the classroom as effectively as possible, and not sort of prejudicing their experience. And she was saying, well, there may be very different rates of take-up for those. You may reach different audiences with that extrinsic frame. You may reach professors that are actually that are not very good with disabled students and wouldn't normally join that sort of training. But she was saying, so the thing for me is, how good is our training at shifting people who are less concerned about disabled students in their classroom to be more concerned? And she was saying, well, the thing there is how long is the training? How many times do they turn up? What does it involve? How many people drop out at what point, sort of thing? Could they just suddenly not turn up? And so it may be that sort of using some of those extrinsic values, if they know in the long term they're engaging the intrinsic values, might be a good sort of hybrid approach. The only risk there is that, like some of the studies we've already seen, and a particular study in Holland, that original framing, the original motivation that you appeal to, seems to matter in terms of how durable people's concern is. So Martin van Steenkist, who's a Dutch academic, did a study where he framed recycling again. He framed recycling either very intrinsically or very extrinsically to a group, very quickly, not very much time, just a small page. And then he had a series of follow-up things over 2 weeks that he measured. So the first was he put some information in a library about recycling, and he told the two groups about the information, so that you could go and look at it afterwards. And he measured, with the librarians, he measured how many of which group went and looked at the stuff afterwards. He also offered a trip to the recycling, to a recycling centre to see more about recycling, and he measured which of each group went to the recycling. He did a survey and a test as well 2 weeks later. So the survey was just about attitudes towards lots of things, and in there was recycling and a few other environmental issues, and a test about environmental issues, including recycling. And he found that the group that he'd framed it to intrinsically were more likely to go and get the resources out from the library. They were more likely to go on the trip to the centre. They were more likely to express positive attitudes towards environmental and recycling issues, and they did better in the test. And so that seemed to last for a couple of weeks. So with the disability example, it might work for some of those groups, but it might also affect their engagement with the process generally, or with the training. Home insulation is another example. So home insulation, it's a one-off thing, and it's a big carbon saving potentially. And you don't need people to keep doing it. So it may be pitching that in terms of saving money is a really good idea. And we always talked about this as a potential trade-off. And then we met with some civil servants from the Westminster, from the Department for Energy and Climate Change, which is the sort of UK department that works on this stuff. And they basically pointed out to us from their data that it wasn't a very good trade-off. So the first thing they said to us, well, yeah, we could. So they have this big policy around home refurbishment that they're rolling out soon called the Green Deal. It's terrible for a variety of reasons I won't go into. But the thing they were saying is we could pitch this very much in terms of saving money. But we know two things. The first is that half of the stuff that we need people to do over the next 20 years to reduce emissions in the home won't save them any money. So how do we then how do we switch later on and say suddenly, no, you need to be spending more money on this? The second is that they had material back from the rebound effect. So they had research back from the rebound effect, which showed that people, when in the saving money example, were more likely to then spend that money on high carbon activities afterwards if it was framed in terms of saving money. If it was framed more environmentally, then they were thinking environmentally afterwards, or more likely to, and therefore less likely to fly to Barcelona with the money that they saved from their home insulation. And they said, so we looked around and thought, how are other people framing this? So then they said, well, so we realized that there are some people doing this, framing it in terms of being comfortable, being cozy in your home. So having a nice, cozy, comfortable home. And they said, so that we looked at that and we did some research and we found that when you do that, there are a significant number of people that turn the heating up and wear shorts and T-shirt because it's about comfortable, and that's really comfortable, you know, wearing thin pajamas or something in your house with a warmer home. So they weren't saving any carbon, they weren't saving any money either. So they were just saying, so help, because we've got to find some way of framing this that will get, you know, that will last, that will be durable and will lead to other things. And I think the answer is in these intrinsic values. They may not be environmental values, but they are the intrinsic values nonetheless, I think. Feed-in tariffs I talked about yesterday. Ecosystem valuation or ecosystem services. TEEB, I spoke briefly about this with some people afterwards. The valuing nature in economic terms. When you look at it through a values lens, it just looks like an enormous risk in the way the risk that I think it all depends on how the policies fall into society. Are they really about knowing how much a tree costs? I know that there's a tree in London that costs almost €1 million. I know that because it was in a newspaper telling me about it, because they were starting to apply the methodology to work out which trees they should or shouldn't cut down. And it's worth that much because it's outside a train station and so many people see it every day. The second most important tree is actually in just a very wealthy area. So hardly anyone sees it, but they're all loaded. They're all wealthy and rich, which I just think is amazing, isn't it? It's like, so we'll chop down all the trees in the poor area because they don't have any income. But it depends. If the policy falls down like that, and there are lots of people in local government doing these calculations and working this stuff out in this very narrow way, then I think it will be disastrous. If it falls down in a way where we really do sort of transcend our current worldview around nature and see that we're not the only thing going on, then it will be great. I worry in the current system and the way that it's being pitched to the current system as a thing to solve it, that it won't happen like that. But who knows? So FITS, I took this is from an environmental charity in the UK, so it's the way it is there. I just thought it was interesting, their image for feed-in tariffs that they were using to promote it. And then this was from an animation on ecosystem services, and I throw it up just because one of the studies that Catherine Vose did in that the money example I talked about yesterday, where they asked people to rearrange words, another study she did was just sitting people in front of a computer that had a screensaver that was dollars, and another one which was fish swimming. And with the dollars, they were more extrinsic, less likely to donate money and things like that. So I just thought that was interesting. That doesn't make us value nature more. It probably makes us value nature less. And so thinking about that, where the roots into the environmental concern through other values, I thought this was a really interesting study. So Tim Kasser and others in the US, they took a bunch of university students and they asked them to basically think about what these three identities meant to them. So the first one was just a general American identity. So they asked them, what does it mean to you to be American? And then the second two, they split the American up and they had a very extrinsic American where they gave them a few prompts and a very intrinsic American where they gave them a few prompts. So the extrinsic American was, America is the land where you can be an entrepreneur, make $1 million and go to Hollywood and be a movie star. Okay, something like that. And the intrinsic American, now don't laugh, was America is the land of the free and is a place where you can pursue family and community values, and we have a long history of being generous to other nations. Yeah. They were Americans doing the study, and then, after having asked them to think about those different identities, they gave them a survey and said, you're going to be making a recommendation to the president in 5 years about what the ideal ecological footprint for Americans should be. Okay? They didn't mention the environment in these primes at all. Nothing about environmental values. The intrinsic values are about freedom, about sort of community, and about generosity. So they were the sort of self-direction and benevolence values. Okay, so it's another example of bleed over, and this is what they found. So the intrinsic prime, they recommended, this is sort of 30 or 40%, I think, sorry, it's about 45%, significantly lower ecological footprints in the future, without directly having been asked to reflect on those environment values. They were asked to reflect on the values that were next to those environment values, the other intrinsic values. So they bled over and engaged the environment values. And rather worryingly for the academics, although this isn't statistically significant, so these two are, this one isn't. So all we know is that the general American identity is basically the same as the extrinsic American identity. So when you ask people just to think about what being American is, it's extrinsically oriented, not intrinsic, which I think is quite interesting as well. And finally, work together. So there's a number of reasons that we need to work together more across organizations and issues, I think, most importantly, because some of these structural features in society are big and powerful, so we're going to need to work together in order to make changes in them, I think. And one of the roles of the Common Cause Group has been trying to identify what these common causes are, what the things that are falling between the cracks at the moment that no one's working on but has probably quite significant influence on the values of a society. So we've identified some of them. And so we've recently released a report on advertising and its role in cultural sort of ethical impacts. So, I mean, personally for me, I've been in about 1 million presentations and workshops where someone says, but we have to create a positive vision of the future. People have to see a positive vision of the future. And I think, yeah, that's great. It's really good. Positive, sustainable vision is great. But if at the same time that your answer is just to push that out there, you're overlooking the fact that people get visions of the future hundreds of times a day, which are given to them by the advertising and marketing industry. In the UK, the most creative people in the country are working for this industry, giving people lifestyles and futures which are not sustainable, which are about just buying and consuming more things. And so I do agree that positive, low, sustainable future can be more powerful than some of those visions, but not 1,000 times more powerful. The average UK citizen sees 1,400 adverts a day, commercial messages a day. So it seems to me, unless you start to reduce, if you start to reduce this, then our positive visions that we already have many of will start to have much more of an impact, I think. Because they're not, currently, this industry is saturating the storytelling of our societies, I think. It's got the attention of everyone and it's telling them stories. The second one, and I think it's quite related, is time poverty. So we know the time poverty is a real issue, and this is not the time poverty that maybe lots of people here feel, because a lot of that time poverty that we feel is voluntary. It's time poverty for people who have to work long hours or many jobs and then also have families and have low incomes. And don't have very much time to do things, have hobbies, do things outside of their life. I think it's a massive problem in the US. In the US, there is no statutory paid holiday pay. Most US citizens, if they're working full-time, get about 6 days holiday a year on top of weekends. And many of them are working more than one job as well. And so we know that people who don't have much time to spend externally tend to be more extrinsically oriented because they don't get opportunity to do the sorts of things where you'd express some of those intrinsic values. And they tend to be in environments that are quite extrinsic as well. So there is not much work on this, but there is work from the New Economics Foundation in the UK trying to propose a 21-hour working week for the UK and using economic models to show the impacts on well-being and other things. I think it's, in some ways, it's the worst time and the best time to be talking about that. I think if it's done well by the right people, communicated well, I think it's really powerful, particularly as a lot of people are being laid off in the UK now, which could actually be much more effectively achieved by reducing everyone's working hours. And the amount of sick pay and the amount of work that isn't really work in the UK is enormous, because there's not very much meaningful work around. I think a lot of people are frustrated that they get asked to do things that aren't helpful. So I know that my dad runs a business that employs about 30 or 40 people, and I go to his businesses, and lots of people there aren't working because they don't care. He doesn't motivate them intrinsically. It's very extrinsic and doesn't look after staff and things. So I think that would be really interesting to start to reduce working time. And I mean, the UK has an exclusion from the EU Working Time Directive, so we don't want to be part of that. The sort of Anglo-American work ethic says, no, you can't limit how much we work. And it's not about limiting how much we work. It's really about being able to get people to work longer hours for lower pay. Alternative to GDP, there's been lots of discussion of that, and I think that would be an amazing thing to just shift the whole focus of. I mean, I don't know about in Sweden, but in the UK now, the only thing that's on the radio is like, this month or this quarter, GDP is up 0.05%. This quarter, GDP is down 0.2%, and everything, lots and lots of things are talking about that rather than actually how we're doing in many different ways. How as a society we're doing. So having those alternative measures, I think, would start millions of conversations that were just different and thinking about what really matters, maybe. CSR is corporate social responsibility. I don't know if you use the same acronym, but so we're doing work at the moment on moving from footprint to mind print. So Unilever, a big global company, they have a long-term plan to reduce the footprint of their products. So they're doing a lot of work to make their palm oil and their soya sourcing and other things sustainable. And some of the stuff they're doing is actually quite inspiring. They're doing a lot of work, a lot more than you would expect, and a lot more than many other global companies. But the way that they advertise links, or is it Axe here in Sweden? Is there a sort of underarm deodorant? Yeah. Is it Axe? And do they market it here with like, if a man puts this on, then women run towards them? Yeah? So that is really prevalent in the UK. So the values that they appeal to in that marketing and the values that they strengthen, being associated with much more sort of around the anti-environmental and anti-social behaviours and attitudes, may well have far more of an impact than their total emissions in the supply chain. So the attitudes and behaviours that they foster through the way they market and advertise some of their products, particularly Axe and Lynx and some others, can be doing more damage than their material footprint. So the point we're trying to make is, if you're really a socially and culturally responsible organisation, then you think about this as well. And you can think about it through this stuff. Will they do that? I don't know. But we're starting that conversation in the UK. And then finally, inequality. We know that countries with greater inequality have far higher extrinsic values. So it's that status anxiety again, more stress, taking away security, having sort of more stratification. So the good news for Sweden is, as a more equal society, this should be much easier than for the UK. And I just now, but you're much more equal than we are still. So I just thought I'd throw this in terms of working together. So this is from the Camping and Caravanning Club in the UK. Okay, they don't have a particularly environmental remit. I mean, it's camping, so it's sort of slightly, but not particularly the caravanning side. But they ran a campaign called The Real Richness that I just thought was really interesting and exciting, and I like it. And the reason is, I think, because this is the sort of seeing the solidarity with other organisations that you wouldn't normally expect you may have solidarity with. So I'm just going to read it out to finish. So, welcome to Real Richness. In today's materially obsessed world, it seems strange to see the word rich associated with camping. After all, isn't camping just a cheap holiday option in tough economic times? But at the Camping and Caravanning Club, we've learned that being rich isn't only about money. Just ask anyone who goes camping about the money can't buy experiences they have on every trip. How it's a priceless chance to get closer to nature and back in touch with who you really are. how working together to pitch the tent and cook the food brings families closer together in a way that everyday life can't, and how there's a genuine sense of community that modern forms of social networking can't replace. We think it's a truer kind of wealth, because it's not about how much stuff you've got, it's about how happy you feel. Yay! So this is my very simple conclusion, I suppose. So the values' impact on the issues we care about. These intrinsic values seem to be socially and environmentally beneficial. The values in turn are shaped by our lived experience. And therefore I think the conclusion is that we can and we should collectively shape our society to solve the issues that we care about. And there are millions of different ways that we can do that. So, group, not table. So now, before questions, if we groups of 4, so you have to rearrange and get excited, for maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes? 15 minutes, and then we'll come back and have open questions after that discussion. So, go, groups of 4. Back in the room, back in the room, back in the room. Okay. Right. So this is just, we have about 15 minutes just for open questions. So based on that little discussion, it's me talking again. So questions from people. So you can stay in your groups, it's okay, because we'll be back in those in a minute. But yes. Is there a microphone?
Well, my question was about the intrinsic values, how you view them. Whether you said something that they need to be learned or developed. And I wonder, do you believe or think that there are some sources of those values that are inborn, or so to speak, part of our humanity?
Yeah, I think sources for all the values are probably there. I mean, my understanding is the values have been developed to satisfy our sort of they've evolved over time to satisfy different needs that we've had at different times. So my understanding is that the more intrinsic ones are about more group needs and satisfying group dynamics. And that group is not just humanity, you could extend it to much broader, to the earth. So they're in us all the time. It's just how significant they are, the different ones, depends on our lives, I think. So there are lots of different places they come up. And I think the best thing, and we'll get into this in a minute, so the next exercise will maybe give you a bit of better idea, thinking ourselves about what is it that strengthens social justice in Swedish society, people's motivation that is an important thing to value. What is it that strengthens unity with nature? What is it that weakens unity with nature in terms of Swedish society and various other values? So I think we'll have a better idea of that in about half an hour, 40 minutes.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Yeah.
I would like to make one comment and one question. The comment is based on 20 years in national politics and European politics at seemingly senior level. I would say that by and large, people with intrinsic values don't survive in politics.
Yeah.
They don't.
Yeah.
Simply because they are marginalized.
Yeah.
And that's a big thing to say.
Yeah.
So that was the statement or the comment. My question is really, I agree with your critical factors there towards the end, in particular to go beyond GDP.
Yeah.
But I think you're missing out one.
Probably.
one important factor in that discussion is that we have a financial system.
Yeah.
If it doesn't grow, it will collapse. It's like a Ponzi scheme.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is one of the main reasons why most policy makers, they dare not touch it, because they know that if we start touching it, it may collapse.
Mm-hmm.
So we just continue. So I think there are some real urgent policy-related, power-related issues that we have to address. And of course we can do it based on the values, and we should do it, but I think we have to understand that this kind of action is going to be very, very, very challenging and very, very difficult.
That's a big comment and a big question. Yeah, we've talked about this a lot in the UK with some politicians from a few different places, and I think you're right in that they're marginalised. I think the other thing is not only are they marginalised, but often the environment in which politicians operate wears down the values over time. So we talked about your lived experience influences your values. Well, if you're in a place which is very much about power and preserving your public image, because that's really important for politicians, how do you maintain those intrinsic values in a place which is is often not very intrinsic? So we have been thinking about doing a project trying to write some advice or guidance for more intrinsically oriented political candidates and political politicians. And we struggled for a while thinking about what does that do? How do you do that? What is it that can help you to immunize you against that environment? And it seems the best way to do it is for us just to interview some of the politicians who have, some of them from across Europe, some of the more intrinsically oriented politicians who have managed to both not be co-opted into the sort of more extrinsic place, but also to still have some influence in some areas on some level. But I think overall, I think you're probably right, that the more intrinsically oriented politicians have less influence because they're marginalised. But it then poses the question about what I was saying before about those political structures and how you change them so that they're not like that. Because we can design them however we want, but it's going to take probably a pretty popular movement to do that, I'd imagine. But yeah, I agree with you. And then in terms of the growth thing, yeah, I completely agree. And it's probably one that we do leave out. I think in some ways, though, I see alternative to GDP and advertising as stepping stones, maybe, as ways of weakening the overall impact of those systems and their resilience against external shocks. Because we've seen from the financial sector that actually, while they have lots of climate scientists would say rather silly feedbacks in the system, they're not very resilient. On some level, they're also very, very resilient because they convinced the governments to give them enormous amounts of money, which maybe they shouldn't have. And so I think, though, that it might be that some of those are strategic levers on the way to it, but ultimately that is going to be the question we need to answer. But yeah, I agree.
Maybe we have to be more political, and we can't stop to say that we have an economical system that don't function. We must say we must have another economical system, and we have nothing more to offer than blood, sweat and tears. And there we must say, we can't say that it's everything going to be cheaper. Yeah. We must take that discussion. Yeah. And we must form another ideology for the society.
Yeah. I know that since I started this work, I've started to understand my more political friends, and I've become more political. And I understand now the reasons that they would get very animated and excited and angry about certain things changing that I didn't think were very important, because I think they could see through they would see things through the values lens. They may have a very strong social justice or equality lens, but there's other ways that you can look through those things. I know there's been some discussion, and I don't know how it's gone in Sweden, but there was some tension in the UK in the transition movement at how political it was, and there's been lots of sort of discussion over its support of activism. So I was personally being involved in sort of climate change activism, and there was some tension there between whether transition seemed to not formally acknowledge that activism was essential or important, maybe, or that it was part of transition on some level. But a lot of the transition people were activists, and so they put this hat on where I'm transition now, and then I have to take it off and go, and now I'm an activist. And that seemed a bit silly, really. So I don't know where that's at the moment, but I know that there was a lot of discussion about that. But I think the critique from in the UK that has come of transition has been that it isn't political enough, and that you can't solve things without being political on some level, or at least having a perspective on that. Yeah. One here and then.
Very short comment, because I haven't been here. I've missed the discussion until now. But I'd like to make a small comment to your intervention. The grounds for pessimism are there, and yet the grounds for optimism are there. In the financial sector in Sweden, there is the JAK, rent-free, how do you call it, interest-free bank, growing rapidly, starting in Denmark, but it's growing in Sweden. Now it's becoming a movement, and that's a new possibility for banking. Then you have a new political culture emerging, because the old one is definitely corrupt. And the Icelandic people showed the way. They put these people in jail. So their answers, coming up, they're meeting, and the last short comment, in the World Social Forum process, we are addressing these issues from the top, but they need this anchoring that transition can provide. Thank you.
Cool. And then one here.
I think it's extremely important is to take an overall approach for the future. And the problem now, as I see, is that nobody has a real alternative to our present system of the society. So we must involve ourselves together with politicians like Anders Wijkman here, with this experience, together with management people, to offer the politicians a new system, how to run the society, and base it from the down, from bottom up. Can you give me any comments on that? We have an experience from the United Kingdom.
I think there are lots of alternatives in lots of different places, and I think we tend to gravitate towards always the big system, but I think there's lots of subsystems within it where there are many different alternatives, and probably when you add all of those up, they equal something that we don't quite know yet, but we know is, we can't sketch it for you or write it down, but it's something very different. The Zapatistas have a nice phrase that I quite like, which is that they question while walking. So they don't, the risk is that you run into something and you don't really know the situation, you haven't worked out exactly what you do, but at the same time you can't just stand there and not do anything. So you walk while you go and you're asking questions and working things out. And it seems like we need to do that. We might need to jog a little sometimes, but I think that is one way to do it. But I come back to the advertising and marketing point. I think we underestimate how much we know already of what it probably looks like, but we definitely know what it doesn't look like. So yeah, it's not an easy question though. And sorry.
Yeah.
Barbara.
So I wonder if you have any tips about framing, because for example, yesterday my husband wondered what the heck I was doing, and I kind of explained to him, and he wanted to run the other way, or you're going to start trying to manipulate people's minds, et cetera, et cetera. So that we avoid that discussion. And then when I pretty much explained to him that he's been manipulated since day one by other factors, he started seeing things in a different way. But anyway, experience about the framing. And then also, I was reflecting a little about the Swedish society, which was primarily an agrarian society before the industrialization, a very collective society. Yeah. It's now one of the most individualistic societies in the world, with a huge, they end up really high on the safety scale. So talk about the UK, Sweden far surpasses that. So it's a kind of chicken and egg scenario. And if you look at the extrinsic values that come as a result of this political and economic system, compared to how it was earlier with the agrarian, what kind of shifts can be made and over what period of time? Because if we're looking at climate change, we don't have a whole generation for that shift. Mm-hmm. So,
I watched a few months back, I watched a documentary on YouTube about the commercialization of childhood. And And I was sitting there thinking, yeah, it's really bad now, isn't it? So I sat down there with some friends and we watched this documentary, and we're all about the same age, sort of late 20s, early 30s. And I think all of us on some level had expected, like, yeah, kids now, they get so commercial. And the whole thing was about our childhood. It was Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles, it was Star Wars, it was McDonald's Happy Meals. It was like, oh my God, we were all just sitting there thinking, this isn't like, yeah, okay, children now, lots of commercialization, but we were the first batch that really had, like, where things were put together and marketed at the same time, where they started using the nag factor to nag parents in order to get stuff, to, you know, to drive a wedge between parents and their children in order to sell products and things. So yeah, I think there is that thing around framing, is that it's happening all the time to us, and we maybe be a bit more overt about it. I think one of the things in terms of not manipulating is to not spend all your resources on framing. To actually do some stuff which is very open, participatory, where you're not just telling people this stuff, you're asking them. I mean, if anything from the studies we've seen, the best ones are where you ask people, you create a space where they can think about stuff and decide what really matters to them. And luckily for us, it seems that when you do that, people gravitate towards the intrinsic value. Yeah, no, they are, but you can ask them very openly about what matters to you. There's stuff around motivational interviewing and other stuff which isn't really, it's very open to go either way or the other. And it seems that when you give people that space, some of it, I suppose, in terms of like, yeah, asking people to reflect on nature and what they think about nature and things, it might be. But it seems to me that for an organisation like WWF, is it really manipulative to be asking people what they think about nature and why they think it's important and stuff like that? I think it's pretty authentic and open because you're a nature conservation organisation. And I think part of it is this sort of, is a problem in the UK as well, it's this reticence. It's like people think, oh my God, we might influence some people. It's like, and then they overlook the advertising and marketing industry. It's like, I wish that the advertising and marketing industry was sitting down saying, oh, well, but what happens if... So it feels like we need to be authentic, we need to be transparent as much as possible and not manipulative, but we will influence people, and that's what we're trying to do. So, yeah, it's just doing it as sort of a bilateral, engaging, two-way process as possible, which luckily seems to be very effective. Final question, maybe.
It's really not a question. It's an idea that maybe if the stress, of course, is a great factor for making us more and more superficial in our views. But if one would create spaces for people and for us to get in touch with our inner intelligence, that could give very good effects in a big, also effects on our well-being and our possibility to see what is happening.
Yeah.
And that would not be to teach anything. It would just be allowing each person to get in touch with a more wise aspect of themselves.
So I think that's a lot of my messages to NGOs in the UK is framing is important, but we can't message our way out of these problems. So I think there's powerful experiences that you can create for people, and trying to shift campaigning more towards creating experiences and spaces. The broader context in the UK, I think, is that a lot of those spaces that were there have disappeared. So we had a much stronger trade union movement that had workers' education associations where people would get together and talk about politics and talk about various texts. We had much more, a much stronger religious network, a Christian network where people would come together and talk about morality and ethics. And it seems like some of those things have sort of disappeared, and that there's a vacuum left, a moral vacuum left, as sort of we've secularized in the UK at least. And well, it's been filled by consumerism. Like our cathedrals are shopping malls now and things. But so I think there's an important role for civil society to think about what it already has, it has a really good opportunity. So in the we'll talk later very quickly about we're doing a report with conservation organisations, and one of the key recommendations I think we're likely to make, I don't know yet, but is that they have these amazing spaces that they could do more in to engage people. They already do lots of great work, but actually consciously thinking about how people engage in those reserves and urban farms and other things like that is really important. But yeah. So there are a few more questions. Maybe if you could come and ask them to me, because we have to move on now. But there will be another, I'll float around as well. So we're going to do an exercise now, thinking about values in Sweden. So in the groups that you were in before, or new groups, but sort of groups of 4, you're going to get a sheet of paper, an A3 sheet of paper. And thinking about this stuff, I'm going to give you a value, and in the middle, you write that value down. And this is an example that an anonymous group in the UK did. And on one side you write strengthens, and on the other side you write weakens, and you fill in what you think in society strengthens or weakens that particular value. Okay? And you can use it like a spectrum if you like, but it's quite subjective, but I think it helps to start to look through the values lens. So social justice, what strengthens that in the UK? So they've got things like universal healthcare, minimum wage, legal aid, trade unions, freedom of information legislation. But they also have cultural things. So 12 Angry Men, is that the film 12 Angry Men? Have people seen that? It's a famous black and white film about injustice. To Kill a Mockingbird, you must have heard of that book, yeah. Robin Hood, and other things, empathy. And so they have broad social circles. And then what weakens it, so they have private services, over-competitive workplaces, Jeremy Clarkson, Sex and the City 2, which is a hideous film. Although, interestingly, it's one of the few films that comes out of Hollywood that passes the Bechdel test. So have you heard of the Bechdel test? So it's named after an academic, a feminist academic, and the test is that the film has to have two women in it with both with names. They have to have a conversation by themselves, like just with each other, and it has to not be about men. And only about 20 to 25 films that come out of Hollywood every year pass that test. But Sex and the City is a hideous film for other reasons. So it's really thinking about everything in this, not just the sort of policies or media. So you can think about publications and magazines, you can think about people, you can think about TV programs, you can think about policies, you can think about types of employment and peers, you can think about hobbies, you can think about the different institutions, you can think about the arts and creative culture and things that are popular, think about certain advertising campaigns, you can think about municipalities and community and local government and the things they do. You can think about campaigns and social movements. And so it's all this sort of stuff. And we're going to hopefully fill out lots of these, and then we'll pin them up over here on the wall and we can all look at them. But we'll start in groups of 4 or so, and then we'll change. So you'll have 4 or 5 minutes to fill one out, and then you'll get another one. And hopefully you'll get a mix of the intrinsic and extrinsic ones. So if you can form into groups now, so if you form into groups, I'll tell you which values. If you have authority, and then the group here, if you have social justice, okay, you can have power, social power, so control. If you the 2 groups or 1 group, so 2 groups here. If you guys go with let's say equality, and you guys are national security. So if you have protecting the environment, do you guys have, we're going to double up some, but if we go with wealth as well. So there's 2 wealths. So value in the middle, one side is strengthens, one side is weakens. You've got 3 or 4 minutes and then we'll change. We're going to change soon, but when you do, if you pass your sheet there, and you'll receive a sheet from here, okay? So we're going to change soon, so if you could pass your sheet there, and you'll receive one from here, okay? So we're going to change soon. So when you do, if you can pass your sheet here, and you'll get one from this group. Okay? Yeah, and then you add on top. Okay. So that is only really the start of something. We've only done it very quickly. What most of you are thinking, or at least what I'm thinking, is you probably generated enough material, created enough material to argue for about 4 weeks about where certain things are. I think when we do this exercise in the UK, people tend to concentrate a lot on what they disagree about or what they're discussing, and overlook the things they immediately put down on either side. And I think it's those things that are the most interesting, and starting to think more specifically about where those things arise and where you could make interventions in different places. You can do this for a lot longer and spend a lot more on it and have different input. And we can share I'll share some of those exercises to Pelle, Marta, and Anders after this, so you can see other ways of doing it. Hopefully, though, you get an idea that initially it's quite difficult. It's not a way that we look at society, maybe, in that frame. But then suddenly, after you've done it a few times, you start to get better at it. In the UK, the people that I find most pick this up are political activists. They just immediately fill this out. They have dozens and dozens of examples all over the place because they have already done this. They already think through. They know lots more about lots of issues around education and health and other things than a lot of people do because they're thinking about it in these terms. But I'm going to hand over to Anders and Pelle now because we're going to have some open discussions after coffee. We get coffee next.
Okay. The rest of the day, up till 1 o'clock, we're going to talk about how do we take this forward in Sweden. And we, that's us. That's not someone. That is not someone sitting outside. It's not the government. It's us. Ska du svenska? Okej. Hörs det i den? Ja, bra. Okej. Vi ska alltså prata om hur tar vi det här vidare i Sverige. Och vi har kaffepaus nu fram till 11:55. Under den kaffepausen ska ni prata med varandra igen. Vad gör vi då? Vad kan vi göra? Och efter kaffepausen så ska det sitta lappar där. Ni ser, det är alltså 13 bord har vi till vårt förfogande. Så vi får ihop 13 grupper nu. Kartaborden finns där. Och ni sätter upp ett ämne ni tycker detta är viktigt att prata om för att kunna komma fram till ett förslag. Vad gör vi? Upp med lapparna där. Och sen 5:30 är kaffet slut. Och då kör vi igång. Men vi säger till när klockan är 5:30. Är det klart? Under kaffet, definiera vad ni vill prata om för att ta det här framåt. I den gruppdiskussionen som följer efteråt, då sitter ni i grupper och pratar om ämnen. Till exempel, vi ska göra en kampanj mot reklamen, eller vi ska ha en utbildning, vi ska be Richard Hawkins komma hit igen, eller vad vet jag. Och sen sitter vi och pratar om, hur gör vi detta då?